Welcome to Module 6, MTSS Essential Component, Evidence-Based Tier 2. Before we get started, do you have the Module 6 Participant Workbook? If not, push pause and download the activities in the workbook. It should be on the website near the link to this recording. The Wyoming Department of Education, in partnership with American Institutes for Research, or AIR, has developed the Introductory MTSS Professional Development Series to support the rollout of MTSS and the use of evidence-based practices in Wyoming. The department strongly believes implementation of MTSS can support districts in implementing several state initiatives, including implementation of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, known as ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act. Today's module, MTSS Essential Components Tier 2, is the sixth of 7 modules. The remaining module will introduce you to the final essential component, data-based individualization for Tier 3. The content presented today should in no way be viewed as exhaustive or legally binding. You should continue to seek and participate in ongoing professional development related to the topics presented today and in past and future modules. By the end of this session, participants will be able to explain the critical features of an MTSS Tier 2 system, describe the essential elements of a Tier 2 intervention, select Tier 2 evidence-based practices, or EBPs, using available resources, and apply the problem-solving process to individual data decision-making at Tier 2. MTSS in Wyoming is a prevention framework for school improvement made up of 4 essential components. The 4 components are screening, multi-level prevention system, progress monitoring, and database decision-making. MTSS in Wyoming also encompasses features such as culturally responsive instruction, family engagement, and evidence-based instruction. As you'll notice in the graphic, each of the components and features contribute to improved student outcomes. Today, we will focus on Tier 2, which is embedded in the multi-level prevention system and informed by database decision-making to lead to improved student outcomes. This section reviews the critical features of an academic and behavior Tier 2 system. This module focuses on Tier 2. Tier 2 requires standardized targeted small group instruction. Small group, meaning 3 to 7 students, but it should be based on the publisher recommendations or optimal grouping size. Progress monitoring is recommended at least once per month, but as you'll learn, more frequent progress monitoring is recommended for some students. Tier 2 is for those students who are identified as at risk. In previous modules, you explored the Wyoming MTSS implementation rubric. Item 4B describes the 4 critical features of a Tier 2 system. Let's review. All Tier 2 interventions are evidence-based in the content areas and grade levels where they are available, and they support academic and behavioral needs. Tier 2 complements core instruction. Specifically, it is well aligned with core instruction and incorporates foundational skills that support the learning objectives of the core academic and behavioral supports. The third critical feature pertains to the use of instructional characteristics. Specifically, all 3 of the following conditions must be met. Interventions are standardized or have clearly defined instructional routines and scope and sequence. They are led by trained staff in the intervention and implement according to developer requirements. And the grouping size and dosage that are used are optimal for the student's age and their needs. The 4th component relates to its being supplemental to Tier 1. Locate handout 6.1 in your participant workbook. Here is the Fidelity of Implementation rubric for evaluating a Tier 2 system. Pause the recording and reflect on what you see in the final column. How closely are you implementing a Tier 2 system? Do you have evidence-based interventions? Do your instructional characteristics align with the requirements? Is your Tier 2 scheduled in addition to your Tier 1 program? So what are the elements of a Tier 2 intervention? Tier 2 interventions should be evidence-based and conducted with Fidelity. Let's take a look at what it means for a Tier 2 intervention to be evidence-based. There are varying levels of evidence for instruction and interventions delivered within an MTSS framework. On the left, you see research-based curricula. This is recommended for Tier 1 or core instruction across all subjects. This means that the components have been researched and found to be generally effective, although the curriculum materials have not been rigorously evaluated as a complete package. On the right side of your screen, you'll see evidence-based interventions. Evidence-based interventions are recommended for Tier 2 and Tier 3. These materials are evaluated using rigorous research design, and there is evidence of positive effects for students who receive the intervention. This means that the program has been rigorously evaluated as a whole, and that the specific intervention program was found to have positive effects for students receiving the intervention program. This graphic illustrates an example of what a school's reading instruction might look like at each tier. As you'll see, evidence standards for the instruction vary by tier. At the Tier 1 level, reading instruction consists of research-based curricula. This means that the whole curriculum, remember, has not been evaluated, but the components do have some evidence. At Tier 2, interventions should be evidence-based or researched as a whole on their impact on student learning outcomes. Finally, at the Tier 3 or intensive level, schools should use adapted or intensified evidence-based interventions. In other words, Tier 3 depends on the adaptation of Tier 2 evidence-based interventions. You'll learn more about this in Module 7. In order to ensure that Tier 2 intervention programs are evidence-based, teams should convene to review the existing research on that particular program. You can focus your efforts by looking at these areas when examining the evidence base. First, consider the type of information and the source from which you are gathering the information. Is it from a reputable website? Is it coming directly from the intervention vendor? What type of evidence is available? Next, consider the population. For which populations has this program been researched and found effective? Is it similar to our population? Are there different effects for different subgroups? It is also important to consider whether or not the desired outcomes assessed in the study are relevant to the outcomes you hope to achieve with the intervention. For example, is it a reading comprehension intervention and showing positive effects for comprehension, but you need an intervention that's working for fluency? Finally, consider the effects. Were the effects of the study large enough to be meaningful? Consider established guidelines for effect sizes when reviewing evidence on effectiveness. Websites discussed in this module will have guidance about how to interpret the data they have on their website. Find handout 6.2 in your participant workbook. There are 3 resources for evaluating the evidence base of published Tier 2 interventions. The handout outlines the criteria and the domains that are used on particular websites. The National Center for Intensive Interventions, or NCII, provides intervention reviews of interventions that have been used at a Tier 2 level. What Works Clearinghouse covers a much broader array of domains, although the criteria for what's considered evidence-based is quite high. compared to NCII or Best Evidence Encyclopedia. As a rule of thumb, just like you would for students, consider looking at all three websites when evaluating the effectiveness of the chosen intervention. In some content areas and grade levels, published evidence-based interventions may not be available. Schools should use evidence-based interventions when available and consider augmenting current offerings if feasible. If evidence-based interventions aren't available, consider using remediation materials that come with your core program, expert recommendations, or standards-aligned materials. Not every student will respond to the same evidence-based intervention. Schools and districts should collect data to evaluate whether most students are responding to the Tier 2 interventions. If most students are not responding, school and district teams must problem solve and identify whether it is an implementation issue, meaning it was a lack of fidelity or poor teacher training, or is it an intervention issue, meaning it may not match the student's needs or may not be as effective in your school context. If only a few students are not responding, teams should do the following: ensure implementation fidelity, ensure staff are adequately trained to deliver the interventions, ensure a match between the intervention outcomes and student needs before changing individual interventions. Changing or adapting the intervention is the most resource intensive and should only be done when implementation and intervention factors have been ruled out. In Module 7, Database Individualization for Tier 3, you will learn more about how to use a systematic, validated process for intensifying Tier 2 interventions for students who have not responded. Now let's discuss what it means to have Tier 2 interventions delivered with fidelity. Fidelity refers to how closely teachers follow prescribed procedures, and in the context of schools, the degree to which teachers implement programs the way they were intended by the program developer. It also relates to the quality of implementation. This means that teachers are implementing the intervention with consistency and accuracy and are adhering to the instructional plan with integrity. Why is fidelity important? If teachers aren't consistent and accurate in delivering Tier 2 interventions, they aren't able to confidently explain a student's lack of response to an intervention. Did the student make insufficient progress because they require intensive interventions, or did the student not make progress because the intervention was not delivered appropriately? Without practicing consistency and integrity in intervention delivery, we can't link or attribute student outcomes to the instruction provided. Fidelity allows us to evaluate the effectiveness of the Tier 2 intervention and tells us when a student may require more intensive levels of intervention. Recent studies have concluded that positive student outcomes are particularly dependent on the aspects of fidelity within the framework of a tiered system of support. One of these aspects is fidelity of implementation at the classroom or teacher level. This graphic provides one example of a way to think about fidelity. It includes the elements of adherence, exposure, quality of delivery, program specificity, and student engagement. Schools should have procedures in place to monitor the fidelity of implementation of their Tier 2 interventions. While these don't have to be formal, it is important to consider whether or not they're implementing programs the way they are intended to be delivered. In the midst of all the responsibilities of educators, small checks can make a big difference in keeping track of services delivered to students. When we discuss adherence to fidelity, we are focused on how well we stick to the plan, curriculum, or assessment. For Tier 2 intervention, this may mean how well teachers implement all pieces of the intervention in the way they were intended. This does not necessarily mean that the teacher should follow the script word for word, but that covering certain content with appropriate pacing and relevant language are important. Duration and exposure refers to how often a student receives an intervention and how long an intervention lasts. When thinking about Fidelity, we are considering whether the exposure or duration being used with the student matches the recommendation of the publisher of the curriculum. In the case of Tier 2 intervention, publishers and developers typically specify the required exposure and duration needed to have the best outcomes. If the intervention developer calls for intervention 3 days a week for 45 minutes a day, you want to make sure the student is receiving that dosage. Not only is it important to adhere to the plan, curriculum, and assessment, but it's also important to look at the quality of the delivery. This refers to how well the intervention, assessment, and instruction is delivered. For example, do you use good teaching practices? Most likely you do. Quality instructional delivery also means that teachers are engaged in what they're teaching and animated in their delivery, not simply reading from a script. Providing teachers with constructive feedback on their delivery is one way to improve the quality of delivery for Tier 2 interventions. Another component is program specificity, or how well the intervention is defined and how different it is from other interventions. Having clearly defined interventions and assessments allows teachers to more easily adhere to the program as it's defined. Is the intervention a good match for the student's needs, or does every low reader get the same intervention? Just as quality of delivery is critical, it's also important to focus on student engagement, or how engaged or involved the student is in the intervention or activity. Following a prescribed program alone is not enough. Consider whether or not competing behaviors make it difficult for students to take part in the intervention as designed. During the delivery of Tier 2 interventions, teachers may need to use behavior management strategies to manage student behaviors, including providing choice, adding elements of competition, and offering frequent opportunities to respond. As you learned on the previous slide, quality of delivery is important in implementing interventions with Fidelity. In Module 4, you were introduced to the high leverage practices. High leverage practices are the basic fundamentals of good teaching. When used consistently, they are critical to helping students learn important content efficiently and effectively. Module 4 introduced high leverage practices in the context of Tier 1. However, high leverage practices are used across subject areas, grade levels, and contexts. Similar to Tier 1, Tier 2 interventions, whether teacher created or published, are delivered using high leverage practices. Examples include explaining and modeling content, practice, and strategies, coordinating and adjusting instruction during the lesson, and specifying and reinforcing productive student behavior. Handout 6.3 provides more information about monitoring fidelity of implementation. Because fidelity of implementation can be challenging in an educator's busy schedule, consider data sources that are readily available. This list provides examples of how you may monitor adherence, duration, quality of delivery, program specificity, and student engagement. There are also other fidelity tools that teams may consider. The RTI Action Network has a list of fidelity checklists, and many published interventions come with a publisher-created fidelity checklist. If you would like to learn more about the resources available for identifying intervention tools, consider completing the optional team activity or individual activity in the participant workbook. You will go to What Works Clearinghouse and participate in a scavenger hunt to identify and evaluate the evidence base for various Tier 2 interventions. Each of the resources provided in the participant workbook offer videos on how to use the website resources to identify intervention tools. Let's learn how to apply the problem-solving process to individual data decision-making at Tier 2. In Module 1 and Module 2, you were introduced to the Wyoming problem-solving process. The four-step process provides a systematic approach to analyzing data at all levels of instruction. Remember, the process starts by identifying the problem and defining it, and then engaging in diagnostic assessment or other review to determine why the problem is occurring. Once you've identified and created your hypothesis, the next step is to develop a plan to determine what should be done to address the problem. Progress monitoring is recommended to determine if it worked. For those students who do not respond or grade levels who do not respond, the process starts over until you've identified an evidence-based approach for addressing the problem. Let's check out a case study. In this case study, we will apply the problem-solving process for a student receiving Tier 2 behavior supports. Remember, the first step is to identify the problem. In this case, Michael was identified as having externalizing behavior problems in January of his 4th grade year due to an excessive number of office disciplinary referrals, or ODRs, and frequently instigated fights with other students. The team engaged in informal diagnostic assessment and functional assessment to determine why it's happening. The grade level team hypothesizes that Michael lacks consistent feedback about appropriate behavior and struggles with motivation. The team selects a Tier 2 intervention used in the school, check in and check out. The team has already reviewed the evidence base and determined it matches the student's needs. Check in, check out is a simple procedure in which a dedicated staff person checks in with the student to get ready for the day. Teachers provide feedback on the student goals throughout the day using a check-in, check-out card. Dedicated staff then check the student out and reflect on the success of the day. The student accumulates points that can be traded in for activities, prizes, and free time. While Michael is receiving check-in, check-out as a standardized Tier 2 intervention, his progress is being monitored with the school's standard check-in, check-out card. For each period of the school day, the appropriate teacher will rate how well, on a scale of 0 to 2, Michael met the 3 school-wide expectations. 2 measures of Michael's behavior will be collected. The first are the points earned on his check-in, check-out card, and the second are his office discipline referrals. His teacher uses a brief self-assessment to verify that the intervention is being implemented with Fidelity. Take a moment to review Handout 6.5 in your participant workbook. There you will find Michael's data. Did it work? Consider the progress monitoring data and respond to the questions on Handout 6.5. Pause the recording if you'd like to complete the activity. Michael's data indicate that he had a positive response. However, given that his performance is not very consistent, the team may decide to continue the intervention or may choose to fade it to a less intensive intervention over time. Let's apply the same process to Jane, who is struggling in reading. Remember, step 1 is to define the problem. For Jane, classroom and screening data indicate that Jane is at risk for reading difficulties. Although she's a third grader, she's reading at an early second grade level. The next step is to determine why the problem is happening. The grade level team reviewed running records conducted by the classroom teacher and other classroom data and hypothesized that she lacks appropriate phonological awareness, word study, and fluency skills. Jane's teacher made sure to implement the program with Fidelity by following key components of the intervention. You'll see the intervention dimensions. She had 6 students in her group at 30 minutes a session, 3 times a week. These align with the publisher recommendations. The program is expected to last 7 weeks, and the content, it requires explicit instruction covering all the components laid out in the manual. The team also develops a progress monitoring plan to ensure that they can monitor her progress in the intervention. This graph shows Jane's reading progress monitoring data using passage reading fluency. What scores in correct words read per minute. The first 3 scores, before the first vertical line, show her baseline data. This score is connected with her target score. The X on the far right forms the goal line. The second set of scores was collected during Jane's time in the Tier 2 reading intervention. Locate handout 6.6 in your participant workbook for a copy of Jane's data. What do you think? Does she have a positive response, a negative response, or a questionable response? The team determines that Jane is making progress, but the progress is not adequate for her to reach her goal. Teams should be looking to change the intervention in some way. One recommendation would be to increase the frequency since the initial intervention seems to be working and just not working enough. The team determined that while she was making progress, it was not sufficient to meet her goal. Jane's teacher confirmed that each component of the program was delivered with fidelity. After reviewing the data, the team determines that the intervention is having a positive effect, but it does not seem to be intense enough for her. They decide to increase the frequency of the intervention, but not change the intervention. The team will indicate the change in the progress monitoring data sheet. Note, the increase in frequency does not necessarily change the intervention from Tier 2 to Tier 3. Tier 3 adaptations and intensification are reserved for students who have persistent and significant needs. The difference between Tier 2 and Tier 3 will be discussed in Module 7. After the change in the intervention, the team continued to monitor using procedures outlined in the Progress Monitoring Plan. What was the impact of the new Tier 2 intervention? Positive, questionable, or poor? What do you think should be the team's next steps? In this case, the intervention adaptation or change indicated by the red dashed line seems to demonstrate that it's working for her. The team is likely to continue the intervention until she meets her goal. In Module 3, you were introduced to the importance of monitoring the effectiveness of an MTSS system and individual tiers of instruction. Similar to Tier 1, it is important to confirm that Tier 2 is working for most students once interventions have been in place for a period of time. Specifically, comparing the average progress monitoring scores of students in different intervention groups allows practitioners an easy way to compare and contrast the efficacy of interventions. Average progress monitoring data by intervention type can help us answer questions like, are most students in Tier 2 benefiting from the intervention? And which interventions lead to higher growth rates and increased student outcomes? Because the continued use of ineffective interventions can be costly and harmful to students, it's helpful to consider these questions right away. Now that you've learned the critical features of a Tier 2 system and how to use the problem-solving approach to monitor response to Tier 2 interventions, let's look at some next steps. The Wyoming Department of Ed hosts the Wyoming Project WIN website. It provides valuable resources to support MTSS implementation in Wyoming. You can access the website by going to wyominginstructionalnetwork.com. There are a number of resources presented in this module and in your participant workbook that can help you in identifying evidence-based Tier 2 interventions. The National Center on Intensive Interventions Tools Chart are considered a leading resource in identifying interventions. The What Works Clearinghouse, which was recently redesigned, provides practitioners a very broad look at all of the different domains assessed in education. Best Evidence Encyclopedia and RTI Action Network provide additional tools that may be helpful for implementing Tier 2 interventions. Now that you've completed Module 6, consider taking the Module 6 quiz. You can contact Bart Lyman, the state MTSS coach, for the answers. It's also recommended that you complete the optional team activity, which is the What Works Clearinghouse Scavenger Hunt. It's important to be familiar with the tools that are available to help us be good consumers of interventions. Once you've completed this module, consider completing Module 7, which looks at database individualization for Tier 3. If you have any questions, contact Bart Lyman, the Wyoming State MTSS coach. You can also contact Jennifer Heiler, the Wyoming State Personnel Development Grant Program Manager. Thank you for participating in your Module 6